November 2016. A small television studio, somewhere in Texas. The lights are too bright. The cameras are too close. And sitting across from daytime talk show host Dr. Phil McGraw is a woman the world once knew as one of the most distinctive faces in American cinema. Her hair is disheveled. Her eyes dart nervously between the host and something only she can see. And then she says the words that will haunt anyone who heard them. "I'm very sick. I need help." She goes on to insist that her former co-star, the beloved comedian Robin Williams, who had died by suicide 2 years earlier, was not actually dead, that he was alive, that he was, in her words, shape-shifting. The studio audience doesn't laugh. Nobody laughs, because what they are witnessing in real time on a syndicated daytime program is a woman in the grip of a mental health crisis being broadcast into millions of homes for entertainment. This was Shelley Duvall, the actress who once made Robert Altman fall in love with her presence at a Houston house party. The woman Stanley Kubrick pushed to the absolute edge of human endurance to create one of the most iconic horror performances in cinema history, the Cannes Film Festival's Best Actress winner. The visionary producer who gave an entire generation of children their first taste of fairy tales on television. And here she was, isolated, frightened, and visibly unwell, while a television host built a ratings spectacle around her suffering. The backlash was immediate and furious. Director Stanley Kubrick's own daughter, Vivian Kubrick, called the interview lurid and shameful. Actress Mia Farrow called it exploitation. Her own director's daughter, someone whose father had famously pushed Shelley harder than any actress had ever been pushed before, was now defending her against a different kind of cruelty entirely. 8 years later, on July 11, 2024, Shelley Duvall died in her sleep at her home in Blanco, Texas. She was 75 years old. The cause was complications from diabetes, after months of suffering in hospice care. But to truly understand how a woman this talented, this beloved, this singular in the history of American film ended up isolated in rural Texas, fighting both her body and her mind in near total seclusion, you have to go back to a young woman in Houston who never wanted to be an actress at all, and who became one of the most fascinating screen presences of the 1970s almost by accident. This is the story of Shelley Duvall. Shelley Alexis Duvall was born on July 7th, 1949, in Fort Worth, Texas, the oldest of 4 children and the only daughter. Her father, Bobby, was a cattle auctioneer who later became an attorney. Her mother worked as a realtor. When Shelley was 5, the family relocated to Houston, where she would spend the rest of her childhood and adolescence. She was not, by any account, a girl dreaming of Hollywood. She wasn't interested in glamour or fame. She was interested in science, specifically nutrition. Shelley enrolled at South Texas Junior College with the explicit goal of becoming a research scientist, someone who would spend her life in laboratories rather than on movie sets. There was nothing in her early life that suggested she was destined to become one of the defining faces of American independent and art house cinema. And that, in a strange way, is exactly what made her so magnetic when the camera finally found her. In 1970, Shelley was hosting a party in Houston for her boyfriend at the time. By chance, crew members working for the legendary director Robert Altman, who was in town scouting locations and preparing to shoot his next film, Brewster McCloud, wandered into that very party. They were struck immediately by her presence. This unguarded, unrehearsed, almost otherworldly energy that seemed to come from someone who had no idea she was being looked at. They introduced her to Altman himself. He was captivated, as Altman would later recall about that meeting. He admitted he was initially dismissive, thinking she might just be performing a character. "I was really quite mean to her, as I thought she was an actress," he said. But she wasn't kidding. That was her. She was an untrained, truthful person. She was very raw in Brewster, but quite magic. That was it. No formal training. No years of auditions and rejection in Los Angeles. A college science student from Houston was cast, almost on a whim, in a feature film by one of the most respected directors in American cinema. She flew across the country for the first time in her life to promote Brewster McCloud. She appeared in Vogue. The film wasn't an instant commercial success, but critics noticed her. There was something about Shelley Duvall that simply could not be replicated by anyone trained in a conventional acting school. Roger Ebert would later write that she looks and sounds like almost nobody else, and possessed an openness so complete that it felt as though nothing stood between her face and the audience's eyes. No camera, no dialogue, no makeup, no method. If this story is pulling you in already, hit that like button now. It genuinely helps this story reach more people who deserve to know it. What followed was one of the most remarkable runs of any actress in the 1970s. Robert Altman, having discovered something rare in her, made her his protege and cast her in film after film. McCabe and Mrs. Miller in 1971, where she played a mail-order bride. Thieves Like Us. Nashville in 1975, the ensemble masterpiece that helped cement Altman's reputation as one of the defining American directors of the decade. Buffalo Bill and the Indians. And then came Three Women in 1977, where Duvall played Millie Lamerose, a delusional, desperately lonely health spa worker convinced everyone around her admired her, when in truth, almost no one did. It was a performance of profound vulnerability and unsettling self-deception, and it earned Shelley Duvall the Best Actress Award at the Cannes Film Festival, one of the most prestigious honors in international cinema. In that same extraordinary stretch of years, she also appeared in Woody Allen's Annie Hall in 1977 and hosted Saturday Night Live, expanding far beyond Altman's orbit into broader landscape of American comedy and film. By the end of the decade, Shelley Duvall was no longer an accidental discovery from a Houston house party. She was one of the most original and unpredictable actresses working in American film. A leading lady whose strange, saucer-eyed beauty and unfiltered vulnerability could not be manufactured by any studio system. And then, in 1980, came the role that would define her forever in the public imagination, and the role that would very nearly destroy her. Stanley Kubrick was already a legend by the time he began adapting Stephen King's novel The Shining for the screen, a perfectionist of almost mythological proportions, known for demanding dozens, sometimes hundreds, of takes from his actors in pursuit of something he alone could see in his mind. He cast Shelley Duvall as Wendy Torrance, the terrified wife of Jack Nicholson's descending into madness Jack Torrance, trapped with her family in the isolated, haunted Overlook Hotel. What happened on that set, over the course of an agonizing 13-month shoot, 56 grueling weeks in total, has become one of the most documented and most disturbing stories of director-actor dynamics in the history of cinema. Kubrick, according to multiple accounts, including Duvall's own, refused to print anything until at least the 35th take. For an actress required to spend nearly the entire film in states of escalating terror, panic, and grief, this meant living inside those emotions for months on end, day after day, with no relief. To prepare herself, Duvall would put on a Sony Walkman before scenes and listen to deliberately sad music, or force herself to think about something devastating in her own life, anything that could trigger genuine tears on command. After a while, your body rebels, she said in a later interview. It says, "Stop doing this to me. I don't want to cry every day." And sometimes just that thought alone would make me cry. She would wake up on a Monday morning already knowing she had to cry, on schedule, for hours. I'd be like, "Oh no, I can't. And yet I did it. I don't know how I did it," she said. Even Jack Nicholson, her co-star, told her, "I don't know how you do it." The most infamous moment of the entire production was the now legendary baseball bat scene, in which a terrified Wendy backs away from Jack up a staircase, swinging the bat in front of her in desperate self-defense. Kubrick shot that single scene 127 times. It remains, to this day, recorded in the Guinness Book of World Records as the most takes ever filmed for a scene with dialogue. By the end of it, Duvall's hands were raw and shredded from gripping the bat for so many hours across so many days. Her voice was hoarse from the screaming and crying. She left the set completely dehydrated. And according to multiple accounts from people close to the production, including Kubrick's own daughter Vivian, the stress became so severe that chunks of Shelley's hair began falling out. Vivian Kubrick, who was present during filming, later revealed something even more chilling, that her father had instructed the entire crew not to show Duvall any sympathy whatsoever. He wanted her isolated, cut off from basic human warmth and reassurance, so that her exhaustion and distress on camera would be unmistakably, unbearably real. From May until October, I was really in and out of ill health because the stress of the role was so great, Duvall said years later, describing the toll the production took on her body during those months. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. There's a lot more to this story, and what happens after The Shining is just as heartbreaking as what happened during it. Here is what makes Shelley Duvall's story so devastatingly complicated and so different from the simple narrative of victimhood. She never fully condemned Stanley Kubrick for what he put her through. In numerous interviews over following decades, Duvall described Kubrick as warm, friendly, and intellectually engaging away from the camera. "He was very warm and friendly to me," she said. She recalled production as something close to primal scream therapy, an experience that was, in her own words, almost unbearable, but that also left her, after each grueling day of filming, feeling strangely very contented once she returned home. She told interviewers she wouldn't trade the experience for anything, because working with, as she put it, lovable Stanley had been a fascinating learning experience despite everything she endured. It is one of the most haunting contradictions at the heart of this entire story. A woman who experienced what many film historians and critics now describe, without hesitation, as psychological abuse on a film set, and who nonetheless spoke about her tormentor with something resembling tenderness and gratitude for the rest of her life. Stephen King, the author of the original novel, never forgave the film for what it did to his character. He criticized Kubrick's portrayal of Wendy Torrance as misogynistic, saying she was reduced to someone who exists just to scream and be stupid, a far cry from the more resilient woman he had written in his book. The Shining went on to become one of the most influential and terrifying horror films ever made. Decades later, in 2018, the American Film Institute and the broader film community would come to recognize Duvall's performance not as a failure, but as a feat of extraordinary, almost unbearable bravery. In 2022, the Razzies, the organization infamous for mocking what it considers the worst performances in film, formally apologized to Duvall and rescinded a nomination they had given her for the role decades earlier, acknowledging publicly that what she endured to deliver that performance deserved recognition, not ridicule. But that recognition came far too late to spare her from the toll it took. After The Shining, Shelley Duvall continued working. In that same extraordinary year of 1980, she starred opposite Robin Williams as Olive Oyl in Robert Altman's live-action adaptation of Popeye, a role that seemed almost tailor-made for her singular physical presence. She went on to appear in Terry Gilliam's fantasy adventure Time Bandits in 1981, and opposite Steve Martin in the romantic comedy Roxanne in 1987, but was in the world of children's television, somewhat removed from the glare of Hollywood's leading lady spotlight, where Shelley Duvall found a different kind of creative fulfillment, one she built and controlled herself. She founded her own production companies, Platypus and Think Entertainment, and created Fairy Tale Theater, which ran from 1982 to 1987, bringing together an extraordinary roster of A-list actors to perform classic fairy tales for television audiences. The show won a Peabody Award in 1984. She followed it with Tall Tales and Legends and later Shelley Duvall's Bedtime Stories, earning multiple Emmy nominations along the way and 8 Cablevision Awards across 15 nominations. For a stretch of years, Shelley Duvall wasn't just a celebrated actress who had survived one of cinema's most punishing shoots. She was a successful producer, a businesswoman, someone shaping an entire creative empire of her own design, introducing children across America to storytelling in a way that would echo for decades. In fact, decades later, in the 2020s, clips of her warmly introducing herself at the start of each Fairy Tale Theater episode, simply saying, "Hello, I'm Shelley Duvall," would go viral on TikTok, introducing an entirely new generation, Generation Z, to a woman most of them had never heard of before. But in the 1990s, the trajectory of her life began to shift in ways that would eventually pull her almost entirely out of public view. In 1994, the devastating Northridge earthquake struck Los Angeles, and Shelley Duvall's home in California was destroyed. Around the same time, her brother became seriously ill. Together, these two events pushed Duvall and her longtime partner, musician Dan Gilroy, whom she had met while filming the Disney Channel's Mother Goose Rock and Rhyme in 1990, to leave California behind and relocate to Texas, the state where she'd grown up. Contrary to some assumptions that would circulate later, this move was not, by most accounts, primarily driven by any decline in her mental health. It was driven by displacement, by family obligation, and by a genuine desire to return home. She sold her production companies in the 1990s and acted only sporadically after that point. A role in Steven Soderbergh's The Underneath in 1995, a part in Jane Campion's The Portrait of a Lady in 1996, and then in 2002, a comedic role in Gabrielle Burton's independent film Manna from Heaven. After that film, Shelley Duvall essentially disappeared from the screen entirely, announcing what would become an indefinite hiatus from acting that stretched on for 20 years. She settled into a quiet, deeply private life on the banks of a river in the Texas Hill Country, in the small community of Blanco. Locals there came to think of her less as a faded Hollywood star and more as, in the words of one resident, an eccentric and beloved local aunt. She drove a white Toyota 4Runner that was, according to one journalist who eventually tracked her down, packed from floor to roof with an eclectic accumulation of personal belongings: a bucket of plastic silverware, a jar of sliced mushrooms, a bouquet of silk roses. Her favorite place to sit, even when the car was parked, was behind the wheel. For years, almost nobody from her old Hollywood life knew where she was, or how she was doing. What do you think drives someone who reached that level of fame to walk away from it so completely? Let us know in the comments. It's one of the most fascinating and least understood parts of Shelley's story. And then came November 2016, and the Dr. Phil interview that would reintroduce Shelley Duvall to the world in the cruelest possible way. According to later reporting, Duvall's own mother and her partner Dan Gilroy had reached out, hoping the show could connect her with mental health resources. But Duvall herself agreed to sit down for the interview without Gilroy's full knowledge of what it would become. What aired was not a sensitive, supportive intervention. It was, in the words of nearly every major critic and commentator who watched it, a spectacle. Duvall appeared disheveled and distressed on camera, describing fears that felt deeply real and deeply painful to her, including her conviction that Robin Williams, who had taken his own life in 2014 after suffering from delusions himself, was somehow still alive and capable of shape-shifting. "I'm very sick," she said. "I need help." The backlash arrived almost instantly and from voices that mattered. Vivian Kubrick, the daughter of the director who had once pushed Duvall to her absolute physical and emotional limit decades earlier, was now one of her most vocal defenders, calling the show's treatment of her appallingly cruel and exploitive. Mia Farrow called it upsetting and unethical. Ronan Farrow used his platform to call it shameless exploitation and urged people not to watch. A spokesperson for the Dr. Phil show would later state that they had offered Duvall inpatient treatment, which she declined, and maintained that their intention had always been to document the struggle and bring amazing resources to change her trajectory. But for most observers, intention did little to soften the discomfort of watching a once-celebrated film icon's private, suffering broadcast for ratings. After the episode aired, Phil McGraw reportedly continued attempting to reach Duvall, even calling her mother repeatedly, until her mother finally told him directly, "Don't call my daughter anymore." For years afterward, the Dr. Phil interview became, for much of the public, the only image they had of Shelley Duvall. Not the radiant young woman discovered at a Houston party. Not the Cannes-winning actress. Not the children's television pioneer. Just a frightened, unwell woman on a daytime talk show stage. It would take years and the patient, careful work of people who genuinely cared about her legacy to begin shifting that narrative back towards something resembling dignity. Lee Unkrich, the acclaimed director of Pixar films like Toy Story 3 and Coco, and one of the world's foremost experts on The Shining, had been searching for Duvall for years after watching that Dr. Phil episode with dismay. Unfortunately, on Dr. Phil, the world saw what it's like to have untreated mental illness, he said. It's the enduring stigma around it that has helped make Shelley mostly forgotten by Hollywood. He finally located her in Texas and brought with him a trove of photographs from Kubrick's own archive from the filming of The Shining, hoping to draw out memories and conversation. He found that the Duvall he met in person was sharper, warmer, and more present than the brief, painful glimpse the world had seen on television. In 2021, journalist Seth Abramovich of The Hollywood Reporter conducted an extensive, deeply human interview with Duvall, the the first substantial public conversation she had given since the Dr. Phil controversy. I only knew that it didn't feel right for McGraw's insensitive sideshow to be the final word on her legacy, Abramovich said of his motivation for the piece. The resulting article described her memory as sharp and full of engrossing stories, even while acknowledging her moods could shift unpredictably. In that interview, speaking candidly about the toll fame and Hollywood had taken on her over the decades, Duvall delivered one of the most quietly devastating lines of her entire life. "I was a star. I had leading roles. People think it's just aging, but it's not. It's violence." She elaborated further, describing particular cruelty of an industry that builds people up only to discard them. How would you feel if people were really nice, and then suddenly, on a dime, they turn on you? You would never believe it unless it happens to you. That sentence alone says more about the true tragedy of Shelley Duvall's story than any single scandal or headline ever could. And then, almost miraculously, near the very end of her life, Shelley Duvall returned to acting one final time. In 2022, after 2 full decades away from film entirely, she announced a comeback in the independent horror film The Forest Hills, directed by Scott Goldberg. "I wanted to act again," she told reporters. "And then this guy kept calling, and so I wound up doing it." She joked, with the same self-deprecating wit that had always defined her, that Jessica Tandy had won an Oscar at the age of 80. "I can still win," she said. Goldberg later described working with her as a privilege he would always be grateful for. Duvall reportedly experienced real physical discomfort and pain during filming, related to her declining health. But rather than letting it derail the production, she worked the sensation into her performance, treating her own suffering as a kind of method acting tool, the same instinct that had defined her work with Kubrick more than 40 years earlier. "Acting again, it's so much fun," she told People magazine around that time. "It enriches your life. It can really help bring you out of a slump." A trailer was released in November 2022. The film premiered at a small theater in New Jersey in March 2023. It would prove to be the final role of Shelley Duvall's life. By that point, her health had already begun a serious decline. She had been diagnosed with diabetes and was dealing with limited mobility because of foot injury, according to a profile published in April 2024, just months before her death. On July 11, 2024, Shelley Duvall died in her sleep in her home in Blanco, Texas. She was 75 years old. Her longtime partner of more than 30 years, Dan Gilroy, the man who had stood beside her through the move from California, through the isolation, through the Dr. Phil controversy, through her final unexpected return to the screen, announced her passing. "My dear, sweet, wonderful life partner and friend left us last night," he said in a statement. "Too much suffering lately. Now she's free. Fly away, beautiful Shelley." According to Gilroy, Shelley had been bedridden and in hospice care for several months before her death, as her body succumbed to the long-term complications of diabetes. "She's gone after much suffering, which I guess is a good thing," he told NBC News. "After 34 years, I can't tell you how much I miss her." The tributes that followed revealed just how deeply Shelley Duvall had embedded herself into the fabric of American film culture. Even during the decades she had spent almost entirely out of public view, theaters across the country, including the historic Brattle Theater in Massachusetts and the Brooklyn Academy of Music, organized special screenings of her films in the months following her death. The Austin Film Society, in her home state of Texas, hosted a 4-day celebration of her work in film and television that December. But even in death, the entertainment industry's complicated relationship with Shelley Duvall continued. When the 2024 Primetime Emmy Awards aired its in memoriam segment honoring industry figures who had passed that year, Shelley Duvall was left out of the on-air tribute entirely, relegated instead to a written memoriam list published separately on the Television Academy's website. The omission sparked real controversy and renewed criticism that an actress who had given Cannes-winning, history-making performances, who had endured filming conditions that are still studied and discussed today as a cautionary tale about the treatment of actresses, could be so easily overlooked, even at the moment the industry was supposedly honoring her memory. It felt, to many longtime fans, like one final, painful echo of the exact same dynamic that had defined so much of her career: extraordinary, singular talent repeatedly underrecognized, undervalued, or outright forgotten by the very industry that had once relied so heavily on her unmatched, unrepeatable presence. So, what is the real tragedy of Shelley Duvall's life? It isn't simply that she suffered while making The Shining, though she undoubtedly did, in ways that would be considered genuinely abusive by any modern industry standard. It isn't simply that she disappeared from Hollywood for 2 decades, or that her most painful, most vulnerable moment was broadcast to millions of strangers on a daytime talk show, though that, too, remains one of the most disturbing examples of public exploitation in recent entertainment history. The deeper tragedy is this. Shelley Duvall was, by nearly every account from the people who worked with her, witnessed her, and loved her, one of the most genuinely original talent American cinema has ever produced. A woman discovered by accident at a house party, who went on to win the most prestigious acting award at Cannes. A woman who built and ran her own production company at a time when very few women in Hollywood were given that kind of creative control. A woman whose unguarded, untrained authenticity made directors like Robert Altman fall in love with the camera all over again. And yet, for most of the final 3 decades of her life, the dominant image the public had of her was either absence or suffering or both. She herself articulated the truth of it better than anyone else ever could. It isn't aging that erodes a person who has lived inside the spotlight. It's violence. The violence of an industry and a public that builds someone up only to discard them the moment they stop being useful, the moment they become difficult, vulnerable, or simply human. Shelley Duvall gave everything to her craft. She bled for it, quite literally, gripping that baseball bat for 127 takes until her hands tore open. She lost her hair to stress in pursuit of authenticity. Stanley Kubrick demanded. She built entire television empires meant to bring wonder into children's lives. And in return, for too many years, the industry that benefited from all that gave her isolation, exploitation, and ultimately near total erasure. If you made it this far, thank you. This isn't an easy story to sit with, but it's one that deserves to be told honestly and completely. Hit that like button if this video gave you a new appreciation or a new heartbreak for Shelley Duvall's legacy. And let us know in the comments, what's your favorite Shelley Duvall performance? Was it Wendy Torrance fighting for her life in the Overlook Hotel? Was it Olive Oyl alongside Robin Williams? Or was it that warm, familiar voice from fairy tale theater that you grew up watching, only to learn this story decades later? Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because there are so many more stories like this one. Stories about the real human beings behind the legends we grew up watching, waiting to be told with the honesty and the care they deserve. Shelley Duvall once said it herself, more clearly than any biographer ever could. People think what happens to stars who fade away is just a natural passage of time. It isn't. It's violence. And maybe the most fitting tribute we can give her now is another screening or another retrospective, but simply remembering to see the human beings behind the performances before it's too late to matter.